Let me get back to what I was saying. This is one I'm going to put it on my P.H. Lewis, my not P.H. my philosophy major 87 page. But it basically, I want to talk about very simple things. Imagination is important. You know, imagine if we didn't have imagination. You can't even, if we didn't, we wouldn't be able to function. I was mentioning once before about there was an episode of the Dick Van Dyke Show, and this is like comedy stuff. But the thing was that according to that episode, you had this situation where these people, these aliens were taken, Rob was dreaming about, he had this really bad dream, and the aliens took over the world and stuff like that. And, they had eyes in the back of their heads, and everything else. But the one thing is that, like, they were, like, enslaving the humans by basically taking away things humans need to create things, to make things. And one of the things was they took away your thumbs, and they took away your imagination. So you didn't have much of an imagination. And if you think about it, it makes sense. Because if humans didn't have imagination, the one thing that makes us basically kind of the rulers of everything is the fact that we have imagination. People who have really good imaginations generally tend to advance a lot more than most people who don't. I mean, it doesn't matter how smart you are, how intelligent, how much you can do equations and everything else. If you don't have much of an imagination, you have a harder time. And I think it's important to develop a good imagination. I think it's important to develop imagination, and very little is actually devoted to that in school. Mostly in school it's a matter of memorizing facts, memorizing who did what in history, and people think that's so utterly important. Memorizing all these facts and figures. You have to remember who did this and who did that during this war and who did that, and understanding everything about the 15th law of the thermodynamic thing and whatever, and all these facts. And I think facts are important, but I think that having an imagination is even more important. It's more important to have a good imagination, to be creative. I think about the stuff that Abraham Maslow was focusing on, because he was looking at the people who were, the self-actualizing people. And he said that these people have very good imaginations, that's one of the biggest elements of them, is that they're very imaginative, very creative, able to solve problems in creative ways. See, that's one thing that's true. Sometimes you can face a problem and you can come up with a creative solution, a way of solving a problem that no one thought to do. Most people tend to solve problems in pretty much like everybody else. You think of ways of solving problems and doing things the way everybody else does it. And that's what you try to do. Solving problems. One thing about me is I'm a problem solver, and I'm very good at it. But I think what I do, see, I actually have a method. It's more than just imagination. It's like, what I do is it's kind of hard to explain, but a lot of times, it's not that I wait until I have a crisis and then I start figuring. But when something comes up unexpected, usually I can come up with a solution. And I think it's mostly because when there isn't a crisis, I'm an explorer. I'm kind of a person who's very curious about things. I'm always getting into things, always learning. So I'm learning all kind of stuff that's just totally meaningless, pointless information. But I'm just curious about it. Like, I want to know. Like, for example, every day I go past this cemetery. It's called Graceland Cemetery. At first I didn't even know the name of it. Now I know it's called Graceland Cemetery. I also know now that there are a lot of very famous people buried there in that cemetery. There's Marshall Field, the one who created the Marshall Field stores, which now have been bought up by Macy's. They don't have a Marshall Fields downtown anymore. Lewis H. Sullivan, who is an architect who designed many buildings, including the auditorium building downtown, which is beautiful. Old building. It's kind of interesting because it's this building that's like, I don't know how many stories, like about 10 or 12 stories tall, but it doesn't have a steel frame. That's an interesting fact. All the way to support it by the walls. It's a very interesting, unique kind of thing. And he designed a lot of other buildings in New York and Chicago and other places. He's buried there. They misspelled his middle name in the tombstone. I don't know. Maybe his ghost might come back and do something. I don't know. There's a lot of other things, Alan Pinkerton. There's Jack Johnson, who was once heavyweight champion of the world back in 1910. And they made a movie about him called The Great White Hope, with starring James Earl Jones. It was an interesting movie. There's lots of stuff that, and I was just curious about that, and that information may have nothing to do with anything, but I'm just curious, because when I was in France, when I was in Paris, I went and visited all the different cemeteries there, and saw, I went to visit Jim Morrison's grave, and Oscar Wilde, although I wasn't looking for Oscar Wilde, he just happened to be in that cemetery, and other people. But I'm always exploring things, always trying to learn things about the planets, and learning things about physics, and learning things about chemistry, and learning things about history. Not that I'm actually, that all those facts are very important. They're just interesting to me. But then, sometimes when things happen, things help you. It actually gives you clues about things. You kind of can string things together in a creative way. It's not easy to explain that. See, creative people are people who are, first of all, they're not very easy to follow. You can imagine an answer. And sometimes when you start explaining that to extremely rational people, they get confused because you don't follow normal rational patterns. And so therefore people dismiss what you say. They dismiss your thoughts, your ideals, whatever you have to say. Most times in life we don't want to be dismissed, so we follow a line of thinking that will get us undismissed, so that we get followed by other people. That other people will listen to us and they will pay attention to us and they will do. But I actually find in many ways that people do pay attention to me when I start getting results. When I actually start solving a problem, when I start fixing things, when I start creating things, when I start making things happen. This happened, in a place I was working at, that I started actually fixing problems and solving things and doing things. And I actually started getting a lot of attention. Some of it wasn't necessarily wanted or desired, but I was getting it because I was solving problems. Some people were getting upset. Some people in positions of authority and power were getting upset because, they're supposed to be the problem solvers, not me. I'm just a little nobody. I'm a low-ranked soldier. I'm not supposed to be coming up with answers to problems that have been perplexing them for the longest time. That's one of the things, but I think that the main point I'm getting to is that it's important to develop creativity because it's a matter of becoming creative at problem solving. Many of the problems that we face today will be solved in ways that we can't, that most, on average, the average person can't think of a way to solve that. How do we solve the global warming problem? How do we solve the water problem? That there's shortages of water in the world. Drinkable water. There's lots of water, just a lot of it isn't drinkable. How do we solve these problems? How do we come up with solutions to these things? There's all the things that people have thought of so far, but there will come answers, and it will come from very creative people. People who will come up with answers that no one thought of. That to this point, no one at this point thought of. You have to come up with new ideals, new ways of looking at it, new ways of fixing it, new ideals. That's what it's all about. Creativity and new ideals. That's the point. Coming up with completely new ways of thinking and new ideals that work. That's the key thing too. They have to work. That's the bottom line.